You see the Vikings in movies with those magnificent beards, flowing in the wind, looking heroic. What they don't show you is what happened when those beards froze solid in minus 30-degree temperatures. They don't show you the animal fat, rubbed into facial hair until it glistened with seal oil. They don't show you the reality of winter survival in 8th century Scandinavia, where your beard wasn't just a symbol of manhood. It was a liability that could kill you if you didn't know how to protect it. The truth about Viking cold weather grooming is worse than any movie would dare to show. Much worse. Tweezers and razors at Hedeby, these weren't luxury items. They were daily necessities, found even in the graves of ordinary farmers. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who encountered the Rus Vikings in 921 on the Volga River, described them as surprisingly clean, bathing frequently in communal basins. He was simultaneously impressed and disturbed by their grooming habits. The Oseberg ship burial from the 10th century contained a carved wooden head showing a carefully maintained mustache and beard. This wasn't vanity. This was survival science that took generations to perfect. Within an hour outdoors, a full beard becomes a frozen mask that can cause frostbite on the skin underneath. The ice crystals cut into flesh. The weight pulls on hair follicles. The constant freeze-thaw cycle, when you move between cold air and the warmth of a longhouse, creates condensation that makes it worse. Vikings in northern Norway and Iceland faced winters where temperatures could plummet to minus 30 or 40 Celsius. The Lofoten Islands, settled around 500 BC, pushed agriculture to its absolute northern limit. Even with the Gulf Stream current providing some warming, winter survival required knowledge most people today couldn't imagine. This script is researched and factual, using sources from archaeological reports published by the National Museum of Iceland in 2024, specifically their research on turf house excavations at Stong and Thjodvildisberen, and the comprehensive grooming studies published in Science Nordic's 2017 analysis of Viking hygiene practices based on finds from Coppergate, York, which contained over 50 bone combs in a single excavation layer. Now back to the information. Seal blubber contains lipids with a relatively low thermal conductivity. When rubbed into beard hair, it creates a waterproof barrier that prevents moisture from freezing on the hair shaft. Archaeological evidence from Norse Greenland settlements, which thrived from 985 until the mid-15th century, shows extensive use of marine mammal products. The eastern settlement, at its peak, housed around 5,000 people. These settlers didn't just eat seals, they used every part. Blubber for lamps, listed in sagas as providing light and heat, blubber for waterproofing leather and boots, and yes, blubber rubbed into beards and hair to prevent ice formation. Modern tests on traditional Inuit practices show that seal oil applied to exposed skin and hair can prevent frostbite in temperatures as low as minus 40 Celsius. The oil doesn't freeze at these temperatures. Instead, it remains viscous enough to maintain its protective properties. Vikings learned this through trial, error, and cultural exchange with northern peoples. The alternative was losing parts of your face to frostbite, a condition that appears in saga literature as a mark of hardship. Njal's saga, written in the 13th century but describing events from the late 10th century, mentions warriors with scarred faces from ice and wind damage. Egil's saga describes journeys through brutal winter conditions where men suffered from cold injuries. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age skeletons from Iceland shows evidence of healed frostbite injuries on fingers and toes. Research published by the University of Iceland in 2023 analyzed remains from the Skeljastadir cemetery and found markers consistent with repeated cold exposure. These weren't isolated incidents, they were occupational hazards of living in the far north. The beard protection methods evolved from basic necessity. Before they had seal oil, Vikings in mainland Scandinavia used what they had: bear fat, boar fat, mutton tallow. Any rendered animal fat worked to some degree. Archaeological residue analysis from 10th century sites in Norway found traces of animal fats on bone combs and grooming implements. A 2021 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science examined organic residues from combs recovered at the Kaupang trading site in Norway. They found evidence of animal fats, likely used as grooming aids. The fat wasn't just for conditioning hair, it was functional cold weather protection. Structures at Stung in southern Iceland, buried by the eruption of Mount Hekla in 1104, show sophisticated insulation techniques. Walls made from turf blocks, sometimes over 1 meter thick. Turf roofs layered to shed snow while providing insulation. The central hearth, burning constantly from October through April, created an interior environment that could reach 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, while outside temperatures sat at minus 20. But here's the problem. The temperature differential created constant condensation. You step outside from that warm interior, and every bit of moisture on your skin and hair freezes instantly. You come back inside, and the ice melts, soaking your beard and clothes. This freeze-thaw cycle is devastating for exposed skin and hair. Vikings learned to manage this by keeping their beards oiled at all times during winter months. The oil barrier prevented the moisture accumulation that led to freezing. Stepping outside into minus 12-degree weather, breath immediately froze on unprotected facial hair. Test subjects who applied seal oil to their beards experienced significantly less ice accumulation and no skin damage from the cold. Those without protection developed ice beards within minutes and reported stinging sensations on the skin beneath. The seal oil method wasn't perfect. It required constant reapplication, typically twice daily during the coldest months. It left beards with a permanent greasy sheen. The smell, according to historical accounts, was distinctive enough that 10th century Anglo-Saxon writings mocked Danish Vikings for their strange scents. But the Danish Vikings who settled in eastern England weren't using seal oil. They were using fish oil, equally effective but somehow more offensive to English sensibilities. The oil rendered from fish processing wasn't wasted. It went into everything from leather treatment to hair grooming. Archaeological evidence from the Briggen Wharf excavations in Bergen, Norway, dating to the 12th century, found containers with fish oil residues associated with personal grooming areas. Vikings carried grooming tools everywhere, combs made from deer antler or cattle bone, small enough to fit in a belt pouch. These weren't just for removing tangles, they were for working protective oils through the beard, ensuring even coverage. The combs found at Coppergate in York, dating from the 9th to 10th centuries, show wear patterns consistent with daily use. Some had runes carved into them, names of owners who valued these tools enough to personalize them. Extreme cold. Braiding a beard reduced its surface area, concentrating the protective oil coating and reducing exposure to freezing air. Archaeological art from the period shows some Vikings with forked beards split into two braids. The Oseberg carving demonstrates this style. Saga literature mentions warriors braiding beards before battle to keep them from interfering with weapons and shields, but in winter, braiding served another purpose. A braided oiled beard was less likely to accumulate dangerous ice formations. It was easier to warm if it did freeze, and it stayed closer to the face, benefiting from body heat radiating from the skin. Of wool garments. Inner tunics of fine weave wool next to the skin, middle layers of thicker wool, outer cloaks of tightly woven wool or leather. This layering principle extended to facial protection. In the coldest conditions, Vikings wrapped cloth around their lower faces, creating a barrier between their oil-coated beards and the freezing air. Saga literature describes warriors on winter journeys with cloth face wraps, leaving only their eyes exposed. This wasn't cowardice or hiding. It was intelligent survival strategy. The fat consumption improved skin condition, making it more resistant to cold damage. Analysis of Viking-age food remains from sites across Iceland shows a dramatic increase in marine mammal consumption during winter months. At the Adalstrati excavation in Reykjavik, one of the earliest settlement sites, winter layers contained significantly higher percentages of seal bones compared to summer layers. This wasn't just dietary preference. It was survival strategy. Parasites spread in these close quarters. Whipworm and roundworm infections appear in coprolite analysis from Viking-age latrines. Respiratory diseases spread through crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. But the alternative was freezing to death, so Vikings accepted these trade-offs. Health problems beat being dead. Vikings who traveled during winter, whether for trade, diplomacy, or raiding, faced conditions that would kill unprepared travelers. The Vatnsdal saga mentions families relying on their livestock's warmth to survive particularly harsh winters. This wasn't metaphorical. Archaeological evidence from abandoned farmsteads in Iceland's interior shows living spaces where the human and animal areas were integrated with no separation. During the worst storms, survival meant huddling with your animals for their body heat. Your beard, coated with animal fat and possibly wrapped in cloth, was your first line of defense against the cold that killed. We're about 1 degree Celsius warmer than today, but this warm period still featured brutal winters. Ice core data from Greenland shows winter temperatures during Norse settlement rarely rose above minus 15 Celsius along the coast. Inland temperatures could drop to minus 30 or 40. The Norse settlers who established farms in Greenland's eastern and western settlements weren't just hardy. They were desperate, skilled, and well-informed about cold survival techniques. The comprehensive study published in Ruralia in 2019 by Solheim and Iverson, examining Norse settlement patterns and climate adaptation strategies based on archaeological evidence from sites across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Now back to the information. Yule, the midwinter festival lasting 12 days, provided a crucial psychological break from winter's darkness. Feasting on stored foods, drinking mead and ale, gathering for storytelling and games. These weren't just celebrations. They were mental health maintenance in an era when winter darkness in northern Scandinavia could mean only a few hours of dim daylight. Archaeological evidence from Hofstadr in northern Iceland, a 10th century chieftain's hall, shows large communal gathering spaces designed for winter feasts. The structure could accommodate over 100 people. These gatherings serve social, political, and psychological functions. A well-maintained beard signaled that a man had the knowledge, resources, and discipline to survive winter. It demonstrated his ability to secure animal fats, his understanding of grooming techniques, his social status. A frost-damaged face or patchy beard indicated someone who either lacked resources or knowledge. Saga literature emphasizes the importance of beards as markers of masculinity and honor. To forcibly shave another man's beard was a grave insult that could spark blood feuds. This wasn't just about vanity. The beard represented survival competence, in a society where competence meant the difference between living and dying. The high alkalinity killed parasites and cleaned effectively. Vikings used this soap on hair and beards, but not daily. Weekly bathing was more common, with daily washing limited to hands and face. Between washes, the protective animal fat coating remained on beard hair. Archaeological analysis of soap residues from sites like Hedeby in Denmark confirms the animal fat and lye composition. These weren't gentle grooming products. They were industrial-strength cleaners applied periodically to reset the protective coating process, wrapping a cloth around the lower face if venturing outside into extreme cold. Evening, returning to the warmth of the longhouse, allowing any ice formations to melt gradually before wiping moisture away, reapplying oil before sleep to prevent moisture accumulation from night breathing. This routine wasn't recorded in step-by-step instructions. We reconstruct it from archaeological evidence, saga descriptions of grooming practices, and experimental archaeology, testing what actually works in extreme cold. Icelandic Vikings became experts in seal oil preparation. Norwegian coastal Vikings developed specialized whale oil processing techniques, each adapted to available resources while maintaining the core principle, coating exposed hair with protective fat to prevent deadly ice formation. The Lewis chessmen, carved in the 12th century and possibly of Norse origin, showed detailed beard representations on king and warrior pieces. These weren't just artistic choices. They reflected the cultural importance of beard maintenance. A boy's transition to manhood involved growing his first beard and learning to protect it through winter. Families passed down grooming knowledge, oil preparation techniques, and survival wisdom through oral tradition. This knowledge was as valuable as weapon skills or navigation techniques. The outer layer was sometimes treated with lanolin or animal fat to increase water resistance. This treated wool provided an additional barrier against cold and moisture. The same treatment applied to beards. The principle was identical. Create a protective fat barrier that prevents moisture accumulation and ice formation. When diplomatic missions or trade required winter journeys, Vikings traveled in groups, built snow shelters for overnight stops, and maintained constant awareness of frostbite risks. The Greenland sagas mention settlers who traveled between settlements in winter, a journey of several days through brutal conditions. These travelers carried seal oil and rendered fat, specifically for grooming and protection. Stopping to reapply protective coatings wasn't optional. It was mandatory survival practice. The sagas describe travelers who failed to maintain proper protection suffering cold injuries that ended their ability to work or fight. Archaeological finds from across Scandinavia include ski fragments dating to the Viking Age and earlier. These weren't sports equipment. They were winter transportation tools that meant the difference between mobility and being trapped by snow. Vikings on skis could hunt effectively in deep snow, travel between settlements when paths were impassable, and maintain trade routes that would otherwise close for months. Skiers protected their faces and beards with the same techniques used for stationary cold weather. Cloth wraps around the lower face, heavy seal oil coating on exposed facial hair. These weren't suggestions, they were requirements. The sophisticated trade networks Vikings maintained included these survival necessities. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark shows imported seal oil from northern Norway and Iceland. Southern Vikings paid for northern marine mammal products. The demand wasn't cosmetic, it was survival-driven. A merchant who could supply quality seal oil during winter months had a guaranteed market. The religious and mythological context reinforced survival knowledge. Skadi, the Norse goddess associated with winter, mountains, and skiing, embodied the harsh reality of Nordic winters. Her name derives from the Old Norse word for damage or harm. This etymology reflects how Vikings understood winter. It was inherently harmful, requiring constant vigilance and proper protective measures. The myths weren't just stories. They encoded survival wisdom. When saga literature described Skadi's mountain hall, Thrymheim, as a place of cold and isolation, it reminded listeners of real winter dangers. These weren't abstract concepts. They were lived experiences that shaped cultural narratives. They knew that gradual warming was better than rapid temperature change. Saga accounts describe injured warriors being warmed slowly after cold exposure, avoiding fire and hot water. This treatment method, though based on observation rather than understanding of tissue damage mechanisms, had some validity. Modern cold injury treatment emphasizes gradual rewarming to prevent additional damage. Vikings learned these principles through centuries of hard experience. The association with high-status burials indicates that comprehensive grooming equipment signaled wealth and status, but simpler grooming tools appear in ordinary graves across Scandinavia, suggesting that basic cold weather protection methods were universal. Everyone needed protective oils. Everyone needed combs to work those oils through their beards. The wealthy had fancier tools and higher quality oils, but the basic survival knowledge was widespread. But keeping some level of protection until spring was fully established, because late winter storms could bring dangerous cold snaps. Archaeological evidence from longhouse hearths shows varying fuel consumption patterns that track temperature changes. More fuel burned during cold snaps, indicating Vikings actively monitored and responded to temperature changes. Their grooming routines adjusted accordingly. The interaction with other cultures influenced Viking cold weather practices. Contact with Sami peoples in northern Scandinavia, who had millennia of cold weather survival experience, brought knowledge transfer. The Sami used reindeer fat for similar protective purposes. Vikings adopted and adapted these techniques. Contact with Inuit peoples in Greenland brought exposure to sophisticated marine mammal processing methods. Norse Greenlanders learned and implemented these methods. This wasn't cultural appropriation in the modern sense. It was survival knowledge exchanged between peoples facing similar environmental challenges. The archaeological record shows Norse adoption of Inuit-style seal oil lamps in Greenland settlements. This suggests broader knowledge exchange about marine mammal product use. The historical accounts from outside observers provide additional context. Ibn Fadlan's 10th century description of the Rus Vikings mentioned not just their cleanliness, but their grooming rituals. He described communal washing, where water was passed person to person, each washing face and hair. While Ibn Fadlan found this practice disgusting by his standards, it demonstrates that Vikings maintained grooming practices even during travel and trade expeditions far from home. They carried portable grooming equipment. They maintained cold weather protection routines. These weren't home comforts they abandoned when traveling. They were survival necessities that went everywhere. This specialized vocabulary indicates cultural significance. Languages develop detailed terminology for important cultural practices. The fact that Old Norse had multiple words for grooming implements and techniques shows these weren't marginal activities. They were central to daily life and survival. Modern Scandinavian languages retain some of this vocabulary, though the survival context has faded. The end of the Viking Age didn't end these cold weather survival practices. Rural Scandinavians continued using similar techniques into the 20th century. Anthropological studies from the early 1900s documented Norwegian fishermen using fish oil for skin and hair protection during winter fishing expeditions. Icelandic farmers used sheep tallow for similar purposes into the mid-20th century. These weren't quaint folk practices, they were proven survival techniques passed down through generations. The introduction of modern cold weather gear and grooming products eventually replaced these traditional methods, but the underlying principles remained valid. Extended periods, including winter months. The consistent finding is that traditional cold weather protection methods work. Seal oil or other animal fats applied to beards do prevent ice formation. Layered wool clothing does provide adequate warmth. Turf house construction does create livable interior spaces. The methods weren't primitive or inadequate. They were sophisticated solutions developed through generations of trial and error. Vikings survived and thrived in some of Earth's harshest environments because they developed effective technologies and passed them forward. Vikings possessed these genetic advantages, but genetics alone didn't ensure survival. They needed cultural knowledge passed through families and communities. A genetic predisposition to survive cold weather meant nothing without the practical knowledge of how to protect exposed skin and hair. The combination of genetic adaptation and cultural knowledge created populations capable of settling Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The archaeological comparison between Viking Age practices and modern cold weather survival training reveals interesting parallels. Modern military cold weather training emphasizes layering, managing moisture, protecting exposed skin, and understanding the dangers of freeze-thaw cycles. These same principles appear in Viking practices, reconstructed from archaeological evidence. The specifics differ. Modern armies use synthetic fabrics and petroleum-based skin protectants, but the underlying survival principles remain identical. This suggests Vikings had developed an empirically sound understanding of cold weather survival, even without modern scientific knowledge of thermodynamics or tissue damage mechanisms. Norse expansion reached the North Atlantic Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America. These settlements required sophisticated cold weather survival knowledge. The Greenland settlements, particularly the western settlement at its northern extent, pushed into environments where winter survival required every technique Vikings had developed. Archaeological evidence from these far northern settlements shows intensive use of marine mammal products. Seal and whale dominated the archaeological assemblages. These weren't just food sources, they were the raw materials for survival technology. Without seal oil for lamps, Greenlanders couldn't maintain interior light during the dark winter months. Without seal fat for grooming protection, they couldn't maintain healthy skin and hair in brutal cold. The survival techniques that had worked for 4 centuries became inadequate as conditions worsened. Archaeological evidence from the last phases of the eastern settlement shows declining health indicators: malnutrition, increased disease markers, shorter stature in later generations. These populations were struggling to survive in deteriorating conditions. By the mid-15th century, the settlements were abandoned. Whether the last inhabitants died, were absorbed into Inuit populations, or somehow returned to Scandinavia remains unknown. But their disappearance demonstrates the limits of even sophisticated cold weather survival knowledge. When conditions exceed what traditional methods can handle, survival becomes impossible. Protect exposed skin with fat-based barriers. Layer clothing for temperature regulation. Maintain high-fat diet during cold exposure. Understand the dangers of moisture and freeze-thaw cycles. These aren't historical curiosities. They're tested survival strategies that work in extreme cold. Modern outdoor enthusiasts experimenting with traditional methods report success. A properly applied coat of animal fat does prevent frostbite. Layered wool does provide effective insulation. The methods require more maintenance than modern alternatives, but they function. The cultural appreciation for winter sports and outdoor winter activities reflects the Viking-era need to remain active during winter months, rather than simply enduring cold weather passively. Modern Scandinavian outdoor culture, including the concept of friluftsliv, or open-air living, has roots in Viking-era necessity. Staying active outdoors during winter wasn't recreation. It was maintaining the physical and mental health necessary for survival. The saga descriptions of warriors with magnificent beards weren't celebrating vanity. They were celebrating survival competence. A well-maintained beard through a Scandinavian winter proved that man knew how to stay alive, that he had the resources, knowledge, and discipline necessary for survival, that he understood the deadly seriousness of cold weather protection. A 2024 excavation at a previously unknown Viking Age farm site in northern Iceland found a well-preserved grooming kit, including bone combs and a small container with organic residue. Initial analysis suggests seal oil. The farm dated to the mid-10th century, part of Iceland's first settlement wave. These settlers brought cold weather survival knowledge with them from Norway and immediately began adapting to Icelandic conditions. Within a generation, Icelandic Vikings had developed sophisticated seal oil processing techniques. They had to. The alternative was dying. Exposed skin. Outside temperatures averaged -8 Celsius, with lows reaching -18. No one suffered frostbite or cold injuries. The seal oil coating prevented ice formation even during extended outdoor periods. The thick turf walls and constant hearth maintained interior temperatures between 15 and 20 degrees. The diet of high-fat foods, including seal meat and whale blubber, provided adequate calories for warmth. At the end of 2 months, researchers reported that the reconstructed lifestyle was demanding and uncomfortable, but survivable, which is exactly what Viking life was. Demanding, uncomfortable, but survivable if you knew what you were doing. Inside, preserved organic material. Analysis is ongoing, but preliminary results suggest rendered marine mammal fat mixed with plant materials, possibly juniper. This could be direct archaeological evidence of prepared grooming products from Norse Greenland. The plant additives might have been for scent, making the protective fat coating more bearable to live with, or they might have had practical properties. Juniper has mild antiseptic qualities. The Vikings might have understood this empirically. The vessel dates to the 13th century, late in the Greenland settlement period. Even as conditions worsened, Greenlanders maintained sophisticated grooming and protection practices. They understood that survival required constant maintenance of cold weather protection strategies. The smoke inside Viking longhouses created another challenge for facial hair maintenance. Without chimneys, smoke from the central hearth escaped through roof openings, but significant amounts remained in the living space, particularly during storms when opening the smoke hole meant letting in snow and freezing wind. Archaeological analysis of preserved wood from longhouse sites shows heavy smoke damage. Residents breathed smoke constantly during winter months. This smoke settled on everything, including beards. The combination of smoke residue and protective animal fat created a distinctive appearance and smell. Arab traveler accounts describing Vikings noted their unusual scent. This wasn't poor hygiene. It was the inevitable result of survival methods in smoke-filled spaces with protective oil coatings. The teeth of Viking Age skeletons tell another story about winter hardship. Dental analysis from burial sites across Scandinavia shows high rates of dental wear and decay. This connects to winter diet patterns. Dried and preserved foods were harder and more abrasive than fresh foods. Vikings ate stockfish, dried meat, and preserved grains through winter months. These foods required more chewing force and caused more dental wear. The connection to beards is direct. Facial pain from dental problems made cold exposure worse. A man with severe toothache couldn't properly wrap his face against cold, couldn't eat properly to maintain the high calorie intake necessary for warmth generation. Dental health affected overall winter survival capability. Archaeological evidence from 10th century burials in Iceland shows some individuals with severe dental abscesses. These infections could be deadly in an era without antibiotics, and they were particularly dangerous during winter when the body was already stressed by cold and limited nutrition. Vikings understood this intuitively. Saga literature describes grooming as a daily practice even during the harshest conditions. The act of combing your beard, working in protective oil, maintaining your appearance, these actions served psychological purposes beyond physical protection. They maintained a sense of normalcy and control in an environment that constantly threatened to overwhelm. The archaeological prevalence of grooming tools in Viking graves suggests these items held deep personal significance. They weren't just utilitarian objects. They represented the daily rituals that helped maintain sanity through dark winters. Viking women's work included spinning wool, weaving fabric, making clothes, and maintaining those clothes through months of hard use. Archaeological evidence from Viking-age textile workshops shows the scale of this work. At sites like Burka, textile production workshops occupied significant portions of settlement space. Women weren't just making new clothes. They were constantly repairing, reweaving, and reinforcing garments stressed by extreme cold. The turf wall construction technique used sheep wool and moss as insulation between wall layers. Women processed these materials. Their textile knowledge was as crucial to winter survival as men's understanding of protective oil use. Viking beds were elevated platforms along longhouse walls, raised above the cold floor where heavy cold air settled. But sleeping in a relatively warm bed after spending time outside in extreme cold created condensation on any exposed skin and hair. Vikings slept in their clothes during winter, wool layers providing insulation even in bed. But beards remained exposed. The nightly oil application served to prevent ice formation from breath moisture during sleep. Archaeological evidence from the Oseberg ship burial included elaborate bed furnishings, but even wealthy Vikings dealt with cold sleeping quarters. Temperatures inside longhouses at night, when hearth fires burned lower, could drop to just above freezing. The elevated sleeping platforms took advantage of warmer air that rose, but cold remained a constant presence. Saga literature mentions boys being mocked for not properly maintaining their appearance, including facial hair care. This social pressure reinforced learning. A teenage boy with frost-damaged skin or neglected facial hair faced ridicule that taught him to improve his practices. The archaeological record shows children's graves containing scaled-down versions of adult grooming tools. These weren't toys. They were the working implements of children learning adult survival skills. Merchants who controlled these supply lines accumulated wealth. This created incentive structures that encouraged efficient seal hunting and oil processing in northern regions. The economic archaeology of Viking-age Scandinavia shows clear patterns of specialized production for trade. Northern communities focused on marine mammal resources. Southern communities specialized in agricultural products. This economic specialization required reliable winter trade routes. Vikings traveling those routes needed superior cold weather protection to maintain winter trading schedules. These gatherings involved sacrifice of animals and communal consumption of meat. The timing wasn't coincidental. Winter festivals provided opportunities to consume animals that would be difficult to feed through the rest of winter. The feasting also maintained social bonds that could mean the difference between survival and death if a family faced crop failure or other hardship. Religious practice and survival strategy intertwined. The gods required offerings, and those offerings took forms that addressed practical survival needs. Recent archaeological research published in 2023 in the journal Viking and Medieval Scandinavia examined animal bone deposits from ritual sites across Iceland. The winter feast patterns show sophisticated management of limited animal resources. Vikings were buried with the tools they needed for the afterlife. High-status burials included weapons, ships, and treasure, but even ordinary graves contained grooming tools. This reflects belief that proper grooming was necessary in the afterlife, but it also shows how central these practices were to Viking identity. A man's comb and protective oils were as much part of who he was as his weapons. A 2024 analysis of grave goods from the Kaupang Cemetery in Norway examined over 200 burials. 94% of adult male graves contained grooming implements. This universality across social classes demonstrates that cold weather protection wasn't just for the wealthy. It was fundamental survival knowledge that everyone needed. Museums and heritage sites across Scandinavia now include authentic demonstrations of oil preparation and application. Visitors can experience the smell and texture of seal oil, understand why protective wrapping was necessary, and appreciate the daily maintenance required for winter survival. These programs help combat the Hollywood version of Viking life. The reality was more complex, more sophisticated, and more survival-focused than popular culture suggests. When modern people try authentic Viking cold weather protection methods, they develop respect for the knowledge systems Vikings maintained. This wasn't primitive technology, it was sophisticated survival science developed through generations of experience in extreme environments. The documented effectiveness of these methods, confirmed through experimental archaeology, demonstrates that Vikings understood their environment and developed appropriate responses. They survived and thrived in conditions that would kill unprepared modern people within hours.